March 6, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. The oxygen mask froze against Major Hans Kogler's face as he scanned the crystalline sky through his Messed Bf-109 G6's canopy, leading his mixed formation of fighters toward the bomber stream. His ground controllers had promised would be unescorted at this altitude, this deep into the Reich. Akong, Indiana at 12 o'clock high, single-engine fighters with drop tanks. The warning crackled through his headset in growing panic. Kugler's blood turned to ice water. American fighters, single-engine fighters here, over Brandenburg, less than 50 miles from Berlin. It was impossible. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to penetrate this far into Germany and return to England. The maximum escort range of the American P-47 Thunderbolt was Archon, barely scratching German airspace. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach Hanover on a good day, but Brandenburg-Berlin itself? This shattered every calculation, every assumption, every defensive strategy the Luftwaffe had built since the American daylight bombing campaign began. As Kogler watched the glinting silver shapes grow larger, their distinctive squared wing tips and sleek profiles becoming unmistakable, he understood with crystalline clarity that he was witnessing the beginning of the end. These were not the stub-winged Thunderbolts or the twin-boom Lightnings. The Germans had learned to engage only at the outer edges of their range. These were North American P-51B Mustangs, long-legged hunters that moved through the sky with the effortless confidence of predators who knew they had fuel to burn, altitude to trade, and all the time in the world to kill. Ahead of them, 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were driving toward Berlin. Not the usual feint toward the capital before bending away to secondary targets, but a straight, unambiguous thrust at the heart of the Third Reich. And for the first time in the history of aerial warfare, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and all the way back. What Kugler and his formation of 7 twin-engine Me-110s and 410s did not know was that this moment would ignite the most profound psychological collapse in the history of military aviation. A destruction not merely of aircraft and pilots, but of the very belief system that had sustained German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of annihilation were being written now, not in the briefing rooms of the Air Ministry, but in the white contrails carving across the Brandenburg sky at Angels 2-8. The shock had actually begun building weeks earlier. A few in the Luftwaffe High Command had connected the dots. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf, commanding JG-11, had encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick 150 miles deeper into Germany than they could possibly have reached. His after-action report, which suggested the Americans must be refueling at secret bases in Sweden, was dismissed in Berlin as evidence of combat fatigue, clouding judgment. But the sightings multiplied. Hanover, January 29th. Magdeburg, February 3rd. Each report pushed the theoretical limits of American fighter range farther east, and each was met with the same official denial. On February 15th, the Reich Air Ministry issued a categorical directive. Reports of American single-engine fighters operating beyond the Ruhr were misidentifications of twin-engine P-38s or friendly aircraft. Pilots making such claims, the directive warned, would be subject to medical evaluation. The truth was far more disturbing than Swedish conspiracies or pilot hallucinations. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had achieved what German technical experts had declared physically impossible. They had extended the P-51B Mustang's combat radius to more than 650 miles using simple, expendable auxiliary fuel tanks, an innovation so inelegant, so cheap, and so utterly transformative that Berlin had refused to believe it, even as the evidence streaked across its own skies. The mathematics seemed to violate the basic laws of aerodynamics. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel to fly 1,300 miles while still retaining combat performance was, by German reckoning, an engineering impossibility. Hedman Heinsnock, who commanded the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary in early 1944, "We had calculated precisely. The American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers 280 miles from their bases in England, no further. That left all of central and eastern Germany as a hunting ground where the Luftwaffe could attack bomber streams unmolested. It was simple arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. The Americans could not change the laws of physics, but they had not changed physics. They had simply applied it more cleverly than anyone in the German High Command had imagined. The secret was not the airframe, but two revolutionary innovations German intelligence had either missed or dismissed as propaganda. The Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks. The Packard V165023 engine in the P-51B was not merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was an improved version, manufactured to tolerances that exceeded even the original British specifications. Using mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automotive plants, Packard had achieved something remarkable. An engine that delivered 1,490 horsepower at sea level and, crucially, maintained more than 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, a technical specialist with JG-26, examined a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, captured the German astonishment. The engine installation is a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. The intercooler system alone is more sophisticated than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605. But most remarkable is the production quality. Every component is machined to jeweler's precision. Yet they tell us the Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If true, this is not a war of pilots but of production lines. The drop tanks represented an even more elegant innovation. It's constructed from pressed paper impregnated with plastic resin. These 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed just 35 pounds, empty, lighter than the ammunition for one of the Mustang's machine guns. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had developed the laminated craft paper construction method, which could contain fuel for roughly 5 hours before beginning to soften and delaminate. This was more than enough for the 2-5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had experimented with auxiliary tanks as well, but their efforts reflected a fundamental philosophical divide. The German tanks were metal reusable, expensive, and heavy. They degraded performance so severely that any fighter carrying them was vulnerable the moment it met the enemy. The American paper tanks were the opposite: cheap, disposable, and extraordinarily light. A P-51B with 2 108-gallon drop tanks could cruise to Berlin, jettison the tanks in seconds when combat threatened, and instantly regain full performance. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, explained the tactical revolution in a 1944 briefing. The Germans expected us to husband our fuel, to save enough for combat and still get home, but with drop tanks, we could burn fuel like millionaires. Cruise to Berlin on the externals, drop them, and still have our full internal load for 30 minutes of combat at full throttle, plus the flight home. We weren't flying on the edge anymore. We had margin to burn. To understand the psychological impact of March 6, 1944, one must first understand the trauma of October 14, 1943. Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force attempted to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort. Of the 291 B-17 flying fortresses that crossed into German airspace that day, 60 were shot down and 138 damaged, a loss rate of 20.6%, with more than 600 airmen killed, wounded, captured. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated with brutal clarity that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was forced to suspend deep penetration raids entirely. General Mager, Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, declared October 14th the greatest victory of the Jagdwaffe in the defensive war. In his post-war memoir, The First and the Last, he wrote, "After Schweinfurt, we believed we had proven that daylight precision bombing was a failed concept. The Americans would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was impossible and damage limited. We had won the theoretical battle, but Galland, brilliant tactician though he was, made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed the Americans would accept the limitations of existing technology rather than inventing new solutions. When reports of a new American fighter with unprecedented range reached his desk in December 1943, he dismissed them. When his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he accused them of seeing things. It was not until February 20th, 1944, the opening day of Big Week, that Gallen began to grasp the magnitude of the threat. Americans launched 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter escorts, including the first large-scale deployment of P-51Bs. Over the next 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters, and more critically 100 experienced pilots. 17% of its remaining veteran fighter strength, Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Witzgalland, Adolf's younger brother and commander. Within JG-26 wrote after Big Week, the appearance of Mustangs changed everything. Before, we could position ourselves beyond fighter range and attack the bombers methodically. Now, we had to fight our way through escorts, just to reach the bombers, then fight our way out again. Every mission became a battle for survival, from takeoff to landing. The morning of March 6, 1944, dawned clear and cold across northern Europe. Perfect flying weather. At RAF Leisten, ground crews had worked through the night preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet attempted, the first P-51 unit to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer briefed his pilots at 0600 hours. "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B the entire distance. We'll be over enemy territory for 4 hours. Any man who doesn't think his aircraft is in perfect condition should abort now. There will be no second chances at these distances." Not a single pilot stepped back. Ironically, Spicer himself would be forced to abort shortly after takeoff due to mechanical failure, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to assume command of the historic mission. At 0830-730, heavy bombers began lifting off from bases across East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters readied for a carefully sequenced relay escort P-47s for the initial penetration, P-38s for the mid-leg, and the P-51 Mustangs for the deepest penetration and target coverage. The 357th launched 48 P-51Bs, though only 33 would ultimately reach Berlin, attrited by mechanical problems and the navigation challenges posed by heavy cloud cover. In Germany, Reichsmarschall radar stations began detecting the massive formation as it assembled over the North Sea. At Dobritz, the primary fighter control center for Berlin's defense, the initial assessment was that this was yet another feint. The Americans had approached the capital before, but always turned away to strike targets in western Germany. Oberst Hans Trautloft, commanding the 2nd Fighter Division responsible for Berlin's air defense, studied the plot and made a fateful decision. He chose to hold his fighters on the ground until the bombers committed to their target. There was no point wasting fuel if this was another deception. At 11:30 hours, lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. The escorting P-47S, tangled with German fighters rising from bases in Holland and western Germany. Everything proceeded according to the familiar script. Luftwaffe pilots engaged cautiously, waiting for the moment they knew must come, the point at which the American escorts reached their fuel limits and turned back. At 12:55 hours, the bomber stream approached Berlin. Major Hans Kogler led his mixed formation to intercept what they believed would be unescorted bombers. His force consisted of 7 Messerschmitt Bf-110 Zerstörer, heavy fighters pressed reluctantly into daytime operations, along with 41 single-engine Bf-109s. German controllers had watched the P-47S peel away and assumed the bombers were now exposed. Major Thomas L. Hayes, leading the 33 Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group that had made it through the weather, later recalled the moment in his combat report. "We broke through the cloud layer 2 CB-24 Liberators below and to our left, simultaneously. We spotted approximately 40 enemy aircraft positioning for attack Me-110s and 109s. They hadn't seen us yet. We had altitude advantage and complete surprise. The German formation, focused entirely on the bomber stream, never saw the Mustangs until it was far too late. Hayes rolled his aircraft over and dove. Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bandits, at 2 o'clock low. Drop tanks and attack. Feldwebel Jan Muller, of JGE. flying one of the escorting Bf-19s. Survived the engagement and later described what happened next. We were in perfect position, just beginning our attack dive on the bombers when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these must be captured aircraft, some kind of deception. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them, and I knew these were real American fighters with range we hadn't imagined possible. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. Caught completely by surprise and hopelessly out of position, the German formation dissolved into chaos. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down at Bf-109 at low level near Welsson, then led other Mustangs in strafing a nearby airfield. At his estate at Karen Hall, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was eating lunch when the call came through from General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland. American fighters were over Berlin. Single-engine fighters, you are mistaken, Galland, Göring said flatly. Check your reports again, Herr Reichsmarschall. I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over Potsdam at this moment. Alt. Göring's rage was volcanic. According to his aide, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who was present. The Reichsmarschall hurled his wine glass against the wall and screamed, "This is treason sabotage!" The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed. But even as Göring raged, the truth was undeniable. From his own estate, Göring could see the contrails over Berlin and hear the distant thunder of aircraft engines at full power. His aide would later testify that the Reichsmarschall stood at the window for nearly an hour, watching the sky in silence. That evening, Göring issued what would become his most infamous order of the air war. Any pilot who claims to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin is to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters is the Ruhr. This is a scientific fact. The order created immediate chaos in fighter units already reeling from their losses. Pilots who had just survived combat against P-51s were now threatened with court-martial for reporting what they had seen. Several squadron commanders, including Major Gural, simply ignored the directive, instructing their pilots to report only twin-engine fighters in their combat logs. On March 8th, Generalmajor Adolf Galland confronted Göring at the Air Ministry with a piece of a P-51 drop tank, clearly stamped "Made in USA" and recovered from a field near Magdeburg. Göring's response entered Luftwaffe legend. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible." According to Galland's memoirs, it was at that moment he realized Germany had lost the war. Later at Nuremberg, Göring would admit, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up for individual Luftwaffe pilots." The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented not just a tactical surprise, but an existential crisis. These were men who had been taught that they defended an impregnable fortress, that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Allies could produce. Hedman Hinsnock, commanding the 2nd Squadron of JG-11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. We had always known where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted even over our own capital." The psychological impact was amplified by the quality of the opposition. The P-51B was not merely present over Berlin, it was dominant. Its Packard-built Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, far faster than the Bf-109 G6's 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. Its Lamenter flow wing provided exceptional high-altitude handling. Its .50 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower. Most crucially, its pilots were fresh, not exhausted from hours of combat at the edge of their fuel reserves. Unteroffizier Verapuz of JG 301 survived an encounter with P-51s on March 9th and later described the experience. They came from above and behind, always with altitude advantage. When we turned to engage, they would climb away. They had the power to go vertical whenever they chose. When we tried to dive away, they followed easily. They fought like they had unlimited fuel, making multiple passes, following us down to low altitude. We were used to American fighters that had to watch their fuel, make one pass, and continue home. These Mustangs played with us like cats with mice. Johann Steinhoff, commanding JG-77, later wrote about the strategic shift. We had to assume every bomber formation had Mustang escort. Even if we couldn't see them, no more large formation attacks, no more taking time to position ourselves. We had to go in immediately with whatever we had, except higher losses, and hope to get through to the bombers before the Mustangs found us. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin coincided with an accelerated, another crisis slowly strangling the Luftwaffe, the fuel shortage. Germany had always been dependent on synthetic fuel production, converting coal to aviation gasoline through the Bergius hydrogenation process. These massive industrial plants were inherently vulnerable to precision bombing. Before March 1944, the synthetic fuel plants had remained largely immune to attack. Too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort, the mathematics were simple. Without escort, bombers could not survive over the target long enough for precision strikes. Without precision, the massive concrete structures of the hydrogenation plants were unlikely to be seriously damaged. The Mustang changed that equation overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, including 298. P-51s delivered 1,718 tons of bombs with unprecedented accuracy. Production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel output had fallen from 175,000 tons per month to 35,000 tons. By September, it was down to just 7,000 tons, barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts. Training flights were canceled entirely. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 50 hours of total flight time. Compared to the 250 hours that had been standard in 1942, a veteran pilot transferred from the Eastern Front to Reich Defense described the deteriorating situation. By summer 1944, we were limited to one training flight per week, then one per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived at our units having never fired their guns in flight, never practiced formation flying, never engaged in mock combat. They were lambs to the slaughter. The shortage wasn't just fuel, it was experience, confidence, everything that makes a fighter pilot. True measure of the Mustang's impact became clear on June 6, 1944. D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history required absolute air superiority over the beaches. On DID, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 and lost 35 aircraft in the process. Over the invasion beaches themselves, 2 German fighters appeared throughout the entire day. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches. With his wingman, Unteroffizier Hans Vodacek, made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being chased away by Spitfires. In his post-war memoir, Priller wrote, 2 planes. That's all we could manage against the greatest invasion in history. Not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked fuel. We lacked aircraft, and above all, we lacked air superiority. The Mustangs had taken that from us months before, not over Normandy, but over Berlin. Major Vero, who had commanded 3 per JG-54 and claimed a P-51 on May 24, 1944, reflected on the strategic situation. After the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we never regained the initiative. We were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could strike anywhere at any time with fighter escort. We could barely defend our own airfields. The war in the air was lost the moment they could reach Berlin, in desperation. The Luftwaffe developed increasingly suicidal tactics. The Sturmgruppe assault group concept epitomized this desperation. FW-190A8s were modified with additional armor plating, 30mm cannons, and reinforced windshields designed to smash through bomber formations at close range. No matter the cost, these flying tanks were designed to bore straight through fighter screens and attack bombers at point-blank range. Major Walter Dahl, who had taken command of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous proponent of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led 4 Sturm JG-3, supported by 2 groups of Bf-19s from JG-300, in a massive assault against B-24 liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armored FW-190s managed to destroy an entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in less than a minute, but at catastrophic cost. Of the Sturmgruppe fighters launched, 9 were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The escorting Bf-119s fared even worse against the Mustang escorts. Tactics that had worked briefly in July became increasingly suicidal as American fighter strength grew. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, one of the few Sturmgruppe pilots to survive multiple missions, described the reality. We were flying coffins. The armor that was supposed to protect us made us so slow that the Mustangs could make multiple firing passes at leisure. The order was to ram if our guns jammed, but how could we ram when we couldn't even reach the bombers through the fighter screen? Each mission was Russian roulette with all chambers loaded. Germany's last hope lay in revolutionary technology. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D, it could have changed the air war. But the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. More critically, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a blitz bomber rather than as a fighter interceptor wasted precious months. By the time significant numbers were available for fighter operations in late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked both the fuel to train pilots in the airfields to operate them safely. Adolf Galland, dismissed as General der Jagdflieger for his criticism of Hitler's policies, was given command of JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945, even with Germany's best surviving pilots, flying the world's most advanced fighter. They could not overcome the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied forces. Galland himself described the futility. We would take off, shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters, and land to find our airfield under attack by Mustangs. They hunted us on the ground, catching Me-62s during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. For every minute we were in the air, Mustangs were overhead for an hour. Technology without numbers, fuel, and infrastructure is useless. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was experiencing what historians would later call the death of the expert. Veteran pilots who had scored dozens or even hundreds of victories were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The appearance of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was no safe space to train replacements. Quiet sector where novices could gain experience. The statistics tell a grim story. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before combat. By 1944, this had been reduced to 80 hours. By early 1945, some were sent into combat with as little as 20 hours in type. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in England had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type and extensive gunnery training. Johann Steinhoff, who would survive terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later reflected, "We were sending children to their deaths." Boys who could barely fly formation were expected to engage Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat, it was murder. I stopped looking at the replacement pilots' faces. I knew most would be dead within a week. The loss rates confirmed this grim assessment. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 7 missions. Some units experienced 100% turnover in a single month. JG-301, once an elite unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945, while claiming only 41 victories. Littenga, who survived the war with 3 victories. Offered the perspective of a newly qualified pilot. My first mission was supposed to be a training flight of patrol over Brunswick with experienced pilots. We were bounced by Mustangs before we even formed up properly. My flight leader was killed in the first pass. I never saw the Mustang that shot at me, only the tracers flashing past my canopy. I dove to treetop level and flew home alone. That was my combat training. While the Luftwaffe bled in the skies, American bombing relentlessly destroyed German aircraft production. The long range of the Mustangs meant no factory was safe. The great production centers at Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig were hit repeatedly with devastating accuracy. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, testified after the war, the Mustang allowed the Americans to maintain continuous pressure on our aircraft industry. We would repair a factory, resume production, and within days, it would be destroyed again. We began dispersing production to caves and forests. But this increased costs and reduced efficiency by 75%. We were producing more fighters in 1944 than in 1943, but we couldn't produce them fast enough to replace losses. And we had neither the fuel to fly them, nor the pilots to fly them. 3. Gaiswater Commode. 6 grouping commander and 14 Staffelkapitän were killed or captured. Oberst Hans Kogler, who survived the mission, called it the Luftwaffe's death ride. We destroyed aircraft that the Americans replaced within a week. We lost pilots we could never replace. Worse, we burned our last reserves of fuel. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe was a spent force. It could no longer even pretend to contest the skies. The American response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, Mustang sweeps methodically hunted the weakened German fighter units. Airfields were strafed repeatedly. In the week following Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost another 400 aircraft, mostly destroyed on the ground. Major John Mayer of the 352nd Fighter Group, who claimed 24 aerial victories, described the post-Bodenplatte period. It was almost sad. We'd find German airfields packed with aircraft that couldn't fly for lack of fuel. We'd strafe them, they'd burn, and there would be no opposition. It wasn't combat anymore. It was execution. As 1945 progressed, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Individual pilots still flew sorties, but coordinated operations were impossible. The appearance of Mustangs over any German airfield meant likely destruction. Pilots began refusing to fly not from cowardice, but from the logical recognition that taking off meant certain death. With no possibility of affecting the war's outcome, the psychological toll was devastating. Heinz Koka, who had once written enthusiastically about defending the Reich, made his final published diary entry, "I have lost countless friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved, like brothers all dead. For what? We cannot even reach the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are everywhere. They own our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." The Luftwaffe's own records captured after the war tell the story in stark numbers. In January 1944, 2,395 fighter pilots were available for operations. By June 1944, only 1,523 remained. On D-Day, and by January 1945, 742 pilots were operational. By April 1945, approximately 200 fighter pilots were still flying. Of the Luftwaffe pilots operational on January 1, 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war uninjured. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin had triggered a complete annihilation, consuming an entire generation of German aviators. After the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots were remarkably candid about the impact of the P-51 Mustang. Their testimony, collected by Allied intelligence officers and later historians, provides unique insight into the psychological collapse of a once dominant force. Adolf Galland, despite his wartime dismissal and conflicts with Nazi leadership, remained one of the most respected voices on the Luftwaffe's defeat. In a 1954 interview, He stated the P-51 Mustang was the decisive weapon in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the best fighter in every category. The Spitfire turned better. The FW-190 rolled better. The Me-262 was faster, but the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere. Once it appeared over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game, where your opponent suddenly has queens that can move anywhere on the board. Johann Steinhoff, who survived terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later served as Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. His assessment was stark. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe. It destroyed the very concept of German air superiority. We had built our entire defensive strategy on the assumption that Germany proper was beyond the range of single-engine fighters. When that assumption proved false, everything collapsed. It wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe from which we never recovered. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Heinz Koch, whose diary had chronicled the Luftwaffe's journey from confidence to collapse. At a 1975 reunion of former adversaries, he met Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. Anderson told him, "You must understand. When we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like discovering the ocean had no end. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to hurt us. Then suddenly you were there over our capital with fuel to spare. It broke something in us, not just our will to fight, but our faith in everything we had been told." Even the war's highest-scoring German ace, Erich Hartmann, who survived with 352 victories by developing specific anti-Mustang tactics, acknowledged the impossibility of the challenge in post-war interviews. Fighting Mustangs was not combat as we understood it. It was survival. They had every advantage: numbers, altitude, fuel, and increasingly pilot quality. We could only hope to survive and perhaps surprise a straggler. The statistical impact of the P-51 Mustang on the air war over Europe can be measured in stark numbers, revealing both the scale of American success and the completeness of German defeat. Aircraft. Destroy 51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 aerial victories in Europe, with an additional 4,131 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground. This represented 48.9% of all U.S. Army Air Force's fighter claims in the European theater. Loss ratios. The P-51's combat loss rate was 1.2% per sortie, compared to a 1945 Luftwaffe fighter loss rate of 18% per sortie. The overall kill ratio was approximately 3.6 to 1 in favor of the Mustang bomber protection before the Mustang. Bomber loss rates averaged 9.1% per mission. After the introduction of long-range escort, losses dropped to 2.5% per mission, reducing bomber crew casualties by 68%. Range Revolution 47. Thunderbolt. 375 mi, combat radius 3.8. Lightning. 450 mi, combat radius 5.1 c. Mustang. 650 miles with drop TANKSP 5.1d. Mustang. 750 miles with drop tanks by 1944. 100% of German territory was within the operational range of P-51s, precedented in the history of air warfare. Production supremacy. Total P-51s produced 15,686 peak production rate, 320 per month. Cost per aircraft, $51,000 1945 for comparison. German fighter production in 1944 totaled 25,860. Yet operational strength at any given time never exceeded 1,500 aircraft. Pilot attrition and experienced American pilots arriving in Europe: 1,944-45. Average 400 hours flight time. German pilots entering combat: 1,944-45. Average 80 hours flight time. Luftwaffe pilot survival rate: 1,944-45, less than 15%. U.S. fighter pilot tours completion rate: 65%. Strategic impact. Appearance of Mustangs over Berlin, represented more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic revolution in air warfare. For the first time in history, one nation could project decisive air power across the entirety of another major power's territory. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, wrote in his after-action report, "The P-51 Mustang gave us air supremacy over Europe. Not air superiority, which implies a continuing contest, but air supremacy, total domination. By spring 1944, we could strike any target at any time with acceptable losses." This was not just a military advantage, it was a psychological weapon. German morale, both military and civilian, collapsed when it became clear that American fighters could reach anywhere at any time. The Mustang set off a cascade of strategic effects. Industrial paralysis. No German factory was safe. Production had to be dispersed to inefficient, hidden facilities. Transportation networks were constantly severed. An already strained German economy began to unravel completely. Fuel crisis acceleration, synthetic fuel plants, previously unreachable, were methodically destroyed. This created a death spiral. Less fuel meant less pilot training, which caused higher combat losses, which in turn left even less fuel available for training. Tactical air supremacy. With the Luftwaffe driven from the skies, Allied ground forces could operate with impunity. The breakout from Normandy, the rapid advance across France, and the crossing of the Rhine were all possible because German forces could move only under cover of darkness. Psychological collapse. The appearance of American fighters over the Reich's capital shattered the myth of German invincibility. Civilians, who had been told that America was weak and far away, watched silver Mustangs circle overhead dash unopposed. Germany had begun the war with technological advantages in many areas. The Bf-109 was arguably the world's best fighter in 1939. German pilots were superbly trained, many with combat experience from the Spanish Civil War. Tactics such as the finger four formation and energy fighting techniques were revolutionary. But the Mustang represented something different. It was the product of a marriage of innovation. The British-designed Merlin engine. American mass production built in Detroit's automotive factories and continuous refinement based on combat experience. It was not the creation of a single genius designer, but the result of collaborative ingenuity and industrial capability. The P-51D, which began arriving in May 1944, incorporated numerous improvements based on combat experience. The bubble canopy provided 360 visibility. Its .50 caliber machine guns featured improved ammunition feed. The K-14 computing gun sight increased accuracy. Wings were strengthened to carry additional ordnance. Radios were upgraded. And the Packard 516-507 engine produced 1,590 horsepower. Each improvement addressed a specific combat need identified by pilots. This feedback loop combat experience, which in turn enhanced combat performance, was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership and disrupted production, could not match. Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, admitted after the war, "We could design aircraft equal to or better than the Mustang. The TA-152H was superior in many ways, but we could not produce them in quantity, could not fuel them consistently, and could not train pilots to fly them effectively." The Americans didn't just build a better fighter. They built a better system for designing, producing, and employing fighters. The German response to the Mustang revealed the fundamental flaws of the Nazi system. Instead of acknowledging the threat and adapting, they denied reality. Instead of concentrating on fighters, Hitler demanded bomber production. Instead of preserving experienced pilots as instructors, they flew them to exhaustion and death. Instead of admitting strategic miscalculation, they court-martialed pilots who reported the truth. The impact on Germany's celebrated aces was particularly telling. These were men who had scored dozens, sometimes hundreds, of victories. Yet the appearance of Mustangs over German skies rendered their skill insufficient. Experience, once the greatest asset of the Luftwaffe, was now overwhelmed by superior technology, production systems, and operational strategy. They were not just pilots, They were symbols of German martial prowess. The Mustang era saw their elimination one by one. Major Klaus Madusch, with 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944. He had survived 452 combat missions, only to be ambushed by Mustangs while forming up for an attack. Oberst Walter Osar, 123 victories, was shot down by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Even older, American fighters were becoming lethal as German pilot quality declined. Major Hans Philipp, 206 victories, had been shot down by P-47s on October 8, 1943 before. Mustangs arrived in force, but his death foreshadowed what was coming. The roll call continued. Germany's finest pilots eliminated one by one. By war's end, of the 107 German pilots who had achieved 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, seriously wounded or captured. The Mustang hadn't just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had annihilated its institutional memory. By 1945, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in reality. Aircraft were hidden in forests, camouflaged on fake farmland or dispersed to highway strips. Pilots lived like hunted animals, moving constantly to avoid the omnipresent Mustangs. Oberst Gordon Galeb, one of the few senior commanders still alive, issued orders that revealed the desperation. Aircraft will take off only when enemy bombers are directly overhead. Maximum sortie duration, 15 minutes. Any pilot airborne longer than 20 minutes will be presumed to have defected. The fear of Mustangs had become so pervasive that many pilots aborted missions at the first report of escort fighters. Court-martials for cowardice became common, though executing experienced pilots when so few remained was counterproductive. Morale collapsed entirely when pilots realized that even successful missions achieved nothing. The Luftwaffe was no longer an instrument of strategy, had become a shadow of its former self. Consumed by fear and the relentless dominance of American air power, the bombers kept coming. The Mustangs kept escorting them. Germany kept dying. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, with 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944. One victory short of becoming a century ace. His wingman reported 6 Mustangs diving from above and behind. Bartels never had a chance. They followed him down, firing continuously. Even after his aircraft was burning, they kept shooting. This ruthlessness was deliberate. Earlier in the war, there had been a degree of chivalry. Pilots who bailed out were generally not attacked. Damaged aircraft trying to withdraw were sometimes allowed to escape. But by 1945, American pilots had seen too many friends die, knew the war's end was near, and wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Every German pilot killed was one who could not fly the jets or advanced fighters. Germany was still trying to develop American merit. Mustang pilots were remarkably consistent in their assessment of the campaign's progression. Colonel John C. Meyer, who scored 24 aerial victories, analyzed it clearly from March to June 1944. We fought the Luftwaffe's first team experienced, aggressive, skilled. From June to December, we faced their second line, still dangerous, but less coordinated. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely fly formation, let alone fight. It wasn't satisfying. It was necessary, but tragic. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commanding the 362nd Fighter Squadron, observed similarly, the war in the air had become not a contest of skill, but a methodical elimination of an entire generation of German pilots. The Mustang didn't just give us range. It gave us psychological dominance. German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, they were probably going to die. Their tactics reflected this. Early on, they would attack aggressively even when outnumbered. By late 1944, they ran at the first sight of us. By 1945, many wouldn't even take off if Mustangs were reported in the area. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier and scored 11.5 victories in Mustangs. Put it bluntly, the P-51 was an honest airplane. It told you what it was going to do. It had no vices if you treated it right. Against German fighters in 44 and 45, it was like having a rifle when they had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, altitude, and numbers. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't supposed to be fair. Perhaps the most telling testimony came from bomber crews, whose lives depended on fighter escort. Technical Sergeant William McManus, AB-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, recalled, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like suicide. We'd watch our escort turn back and know the wolves were coming. After March 44, seeing those Mustangs with us all the way to the target and back, it was like having guardian angels. Our loss rate went from probably going to die to probably going to make it home." The P-51's success was not just a triumph of design, but of production. North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, achieved production rates that seemed impossible by German standards. At peak production, in 1944, North American was completing one Mustang every 63 minutes. The assembly line, adapted from automobile manufacturing, broke construction into specialized stations. Workers became experts at single tasks, achieving speeds and precision impossible with traditional aircraft methods. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at Inglewood, described the system. "We had housewives installing control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, men too old for the draft assembling engines. None of them had built an airplane before the war. But the system was so well designed that within weeks they were producing perfect work. We had quality control at every station. If something wasn't right, the line stopped until it was fixed." The contrast with German production was stark. As Allied bombing forced dispersal, German aircraft were being assembled in caves, forests, and abandoned mines. Components might be manufactured hundreds of miles apart. Quality control was impossible. Workers were often slave laborers, with every incentive to sabotage production. Oberst Dietrich Rabach, who commanded various fighter units during the war, observed, "We would receive new aircraft that looked perfect, but were flying coffins control cables installed incorrectly, fuel lines that leaked, guns that wouldn't fire. The Americans were building better aircraft in greater numbers with workers who wanted to win. We were building inferior aircraft in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose." The success of the P-51 over Berlin had implications far beyond the European theater. It demonstrated that air power could be projected globally, that distance was no longer a barrier to American reach. This lesson was not lost on Japan, which watched its defensive perimeter shrink as American long-range fighters enabled bombing campaigns against the home islands. Stalin, too, took notice. Soviet pilots flying Lend-Lease P-51s were impressed by their range, reliability, and combat performance. Recognizing that the era of local air dominance was over, the Soviet Air Force, recognizing that future conflicts would require power projection over vast distances, began developing long-range escort fighters. The VVS received 10 P-51s and tested them extensively, though they were never used in combat by Soviet forces. The Mustang continued to serve long after World War II ended. In Korea, F-51s, renamed in 1948, flew close support missions. The Israeli Air Force deployed Mustangs during the 1956 Suez Crisis. Various air forces operated them into the 1980s, with the Dominican Air Force retiring its last F-51D in 1984. 40 years after it first flew over Berlin, yet the Mustang's greatest legacy was doctrinal. It proved that air superiority was not merely about controlling the battlefield's skies, but about dominating the airspace of entire nations. Every modern Air Force builds its strategy around the principle first, demonstrated when American fighters appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses were human beings, young men, mostly in their early 20s, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin carried different meanings for different people, but for all, it was a moment of profound realization. For American pilots, it was vindication. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today." Think about that. We took off from England, flew across all of Germany, circled Berlin like we owned it because we dead and flew home. 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London. Today, We own the sky over Berlin. It's hard to describe the feeling, pride, power, and the absolute certainty that we're going to win this war. For German pilots, it was despair. Feldwebel Rudi Muller of JG 302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today. American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters. It's impossible, but I saw them with my own eyes. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere." The P-51 Mustang was more than a machine. It was a revolution in air power, a weapon that reshaped strategy, destroyed confidence, and changed the course of the war. Its appearance over Berlin was the moment the Luftwaffe and the myth of German invincibility began to crumble. There was no safe place left in Germany. How do I tell you that I don't expect to survive this? How do I explain that everything we believed was wrong? For German civilians, it was the beginning of the end of illusion. Berlin resident Ursula von Kardorf wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never match German strength. Today I watched American fighters circle overhead while our vaunted Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Everything they told us was lies. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? For Allied bomber crews, it was salvation." Staff Sergeant James McMahon, ball turret gunner on B-17 Lucky Lady, recalled, "Seeing those Mustangs form up on us as we approached Berlin, I'm not ashamed to say I cried. For the first time since I started flying missions, I thought I might actually survive this war. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us." As the war ended, the full magnitude of what the Mustang and the broader American air campaign had accomplished became unmistakable. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the war as arguably the most advanced and powerful air force on Earth, no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. The statistics are staggering. Total Luftwaffe aircraft lost, 1,944 to 45. Approximately 45,000 Luftwaffe pilots killed. 1944 to 45, approximately 15,000 percentage of operational Luftwaffe pilots from January 1944 who survived the war uninjured. Less than 5% German cities, with over 50% destruction. 61 German civilian casualties from bombing, 350,000 to 500,000. German industrial production lost to bombing, 35 to 40%. These numbers represent not just military defeat, but societal collapse. Germany had invested its faith in speed, shock, and early victory. Once the war became a contest of endurance of industry, logistics, manpower, and reached the outcome was inevitable. The Mustang did not win the war alone. But it closed the final chapter of the Luftwaffe. Its arrival over Berlin signaled a shift from German dominance to German helplessness, from propaganda to reality. From illusion to catastrophe, the Mustang had enabled an air campaign that brought war to every German city. Every factory, every rail yard, and every airfield. There was no rear area anymore, no safe haven, no respite. Hermann Göring, on trial at Nuremberg, was asked when he realized Germany had lost the war. His answer became one of the most quoted admissions of the conflict: "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just delay, just more dead young men for no purpose." It was a remarkably candid statement from a man not known for honesty. But even Göring, master of denial and delusion, could not ignore what the Mustang represented: American industrial power married to British aerodynamic innovation, projected across impossible distances with relentless precision. The P-51's development from concept to Berlin escort fighter remains one of the most rapid and successful aircraft development cycles in aviation history. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940. Just 102 days after North American aviation received the British Purchasing Commission's request, by March 1944, less than 4 years later, Mustangs were circling over Hitler's capital. This astonishing speed of development was matched by continuous refinement driven by combat experience. P-51A, Allison engine variant, with excellent low-altitude performance but limited capability above 20,000 feet. P-51B, fitted with the Packard-built Merlin V165023, transforming high-altitude performance and enabling deep escort missions. P-51D, bubble canopy. 6.50 caliber guns, improved systems. And the V16 52.7 engine? The definitive wartime Mustang, P-51HA, lightened, higher performance, ultimate Mustang. Fastest of the series. But it entered service too late to see combat in Europe. From rushed prototype to high-altitude guardian over Berlin, the Mustang embodied the wartime acceleration of technology ingenuity leveraged by mass production. Shaped by the pressures of survival, and refined by feedback written in blood and fire. The feedback loop combat experience. Driving rapid design improvement was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership and increasingly fractured production base, could never match. German engineers produced technically superb aircraft such as the TA-152H and the Me-262, but they could not refine them based on frontline reports, could not manufacture them in meaningful numbers, and most critically could not train pilots capable of exploiting their performance. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin did more than win air superiority. It validated the entire American strategic bombing doctrine. Pre-war air power theorists such as Billy Mitchell and Julio Dowett had argued that air forces could win wars by destroying an enemy's industry and breaking its capacity to resist. But until the arrival of a long-range escort fighter, this remained mostly theory. Deep penetration, daylight raids were simply too costly. The Mustang made precision daylight bombing possible, while the RAF continued area bombing at night, achieving, on average, a circular error of roughly 3 miles. The USAAF could now strike specific, high-value industrial targets in daylight with an average error of about 1,000 feet. Ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities, aircraft assembly halls, transportation bottlenecks all became vulnerable in a way they had never been before. General Curtis LeMay, who would later command Strategic Air Command, put it bluntly, the P-51 made strategic bombing work. Without it, we would have had to accept either unsustainable losses or ineffective night bombing. With it, we could methodically destroy specific target sets. We didn't just bomb Germany, we performed industrial surgery, removing Germany's ability to make war. The results spoke for themselves. Ball-bearing production reduced by 70%, aviation fuel output reduced by 95%, synthetic rubber production reduced by 85%, rail traffic cut by 75%, canal traffic in Western Germany eliminated entirely. This precise, targeted dismantling of the German war machine, made possible only by long-range escort fighters, shortened the war by months and possibly by years. Every refinery burned, every rail line severed, every assembly plant smashed meant divisions that could not move, aircraft that could not fly, and armored forces that sat idle for lack of fuel. The image of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin became one of the iconic visuals of the Second World War. Ranking with the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet soldiers at the Reichstag, it represented American power projection on a scale no nation had ever achieved, technological superiority, industrial might, and the certainty of Allied victory. For Americans, the Mustang quickly became a symbol of national capability. It appeared on war bond posters, in newsreels, and later in Hollywood films. That it had been conceived, designed, tested, and placed into mass production in record time by a company that had never before built a fighter. Aircraft embodied the American can-do ethos of the wartime era. For Germans, the Mustang became a symbol of humiliation and defeat. Post-war memoirs and literature often evoke the image of American fighters over German cities as a representation of the regime's catastrophic failure to protect its own people. The trauma of powerlessness, watching enemy aircraft roam unopposed through the skies, left deep psychological scars on the surviving Luftwaffe veterans. Hans Kolb wrote in 1953, "For a fighter pilot, the ultimate duty is to defend the skies of your homeland. We failed." The Mustangs over Berlin were proof of our failure, visible to every German who looked up. That shame never fully goes away. Military Air forces around the world still study the Mustang's impact on the European air war as a case study in how a single technological and organizational breakthrough can trigger a strategic revolution. The lessons remain timeless. Range equals options. The ability to project power at great distance provides commanders with strategic flexibility that the enemy cannot easily negate. The Mustang gave Allied planners freedom of action the Luftwaffe could neither predict nor counter. Integration beats isolation. The Mustang did not succeed in a vacuum. Its power came from being part of an integrated system: bombers, escorts, radar, signals intelligence, logistics, maintenance, and a training pipeline that kept all of it functioning. Germany possessed excellent individual components, but it never achieved true integration. Its system failed even as its engineers excelled. Production wins wars. A nation that can produce vast numbers of good aircraft will defeat a nation that produces small numbers of excellent aircraft. The Mustang was a superb design, but its most decisive quality was that there were thousands of them, arriving faster than Germany could replace its losses. Pilot quality matters. Technology, without trained operators, is meaningless. American training emphasized extensive flight hours, gunnery practice, aerobatics, and formation discipline. U.S. pilots entered combat with the skills needed to exploit the Mustang's performance envelope fully. German pilots in 1944-45 entered combat with barely enough hours to handle their aircraft safely. Adaptation is survival, the American system learned. Adjusted and improved continuously airframe design, tactics, and training at a pace the German system, crippled by political interference and industrial collapse, could not match. The Luftwaffe built excellent aircraft. The Allies built a learning machine. The Americans continuously improved tactics, technology, and training based on real combat experience. Every mission generated data, every engagement produced feedback, and every mistake became a lesson folded into the next iteration of doctrine or design. The German system, hamstrung by rigid doctrine, political interference, and a deeply fractured command structure, could not adapt quickly enough to survive. Modern air forces apply these lessons every day. The emphasis on long-range strike capability, integrated air defense networks, realistic pilot training, and resilient industrial capacity all trace their lineage to the moment Mustangs first appeared over Berlin. The world learned that no nation, however confident or insulated, could rely on geography or past superiority to guarantee future safety. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, marked more than a tactical milestone. It was the moment Nazi Germany's foundational assumptions about the war collapsed. The Reich was supposed to be a fortress shielded by distance, defended by the world's best pilots, flying the world's finest fighters. The Mustang destroyed these illusions in a single morning. For the German leadership, military, and political elite, was a moment of terrible clarity. They had built their grand strategy on the belief that the United States could not project decisive power across the Atlantic. They dismissed American industry as clumsy, American technology as crude, and American pilots as soft products of a decadent society. Every assumption was wrong. And the Mustangs over Berlin provided proof that could not be denied, propagandized away, or rationalized. Adolf Galland later wrote, March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when American fighters appeared over our capital. Everything after was just the playing out of a foregone conclusion. The Mustang did not merely defeat the Luftwaffe. It demonstrated that American industrial democracy, flexible, innovative, disciplined, and massively productive, could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outfight Nazi totalitarianism. The psychological impact rippled through German society. Civilians who had been taught to believe in German invincibility looked up and saw American fighters cruising unopposed over their capital. Luftwaffe pilots who once believed themselves the masters of Europe's skies felt the balance of power invert beneath them. Commanders who had long relied on distance as a shield realized that distance no longer mattered. If the regime couldn't protect Berlin from American fighters, what could it do? If everything they had been told about American weakness was false, what else was a lie? The Mustang became an unwitting agent of truth. Its presence over German cities exposed the Nazi worldview as a house of cards. The Mustang's success came at a terrible cost. In the European theater, 2,520 P-51s were lost in combat. Behind each loss was a young man who would never return home. The 357th Fighter Group alone lost over 100 pilots killed in action, college students, athletes, young professionals who had volunteered to fly and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, when his P-51B was hit by flak near Brunswick. He was 28. Married with 2 children he would never see grow up. His loss was repeated thousands of times across Europe. Captain Don Gentile, one of America's top Mustang aces, with 21.83 aerial victories, survived combat only to die in 1951. Testing a T-33 jet trainer? The echoes of the war continued long after the guns fell silent. Many Mustang pilots carried psychological wounds that never fully healed, yet their sacrifice achieved something extraordinary. They took the war to the enemy's homeland. It forced the Germans to fight over their own territory, and won decisively. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin. From that day forward, it was a broken force, capable only of sporadic and effective resistance. As dawn broke on May 8, 1945, day American P-51 Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany. There was no opposition. The Luftwaffe, that had once struck terror across Europe, the force that had seemed invincible in 1940, no longer existed. Its aircraft lay destroyed or grounded for lack of fuel. Its pilots were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Its command and infrastructure lay in ruins. The transformation from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete and rapid military victories in history. The P-51 Mustang had been the instrument of that victory, the tool that turned Allied air power from a costly liability into an unstoppable force. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots flew over 213,000 sorties, claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, fired 99 million rounds of ammunition. Behind these staggering numbers was a human reality. Young American men, averaging 22 years old, flying aluminum aircraft powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, had comprehensively destroyed one of history's most formidable air forces. As dawn broke on May 8, 1945, VE Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany. There was no opposition. The Luftwaffe, that had once terrorized Europe and seemed invincible in 1940, no longer existed. Its aircraft were destroyed or grounded for lack of fuel. Its pilots were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Its infrastructure lay in rubble. The transformation from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete military victories in history. The P-51 Mustang had been the instrument of that victory, the tool that turned Allied air power from a costly liability into an irresistible force. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots flew over 213,000 sorties, claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, and fired 99 million rounds of ammunition. Behind these statistics was a human reality. Young American men, average age 22, flying aluminum aircraft powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, had comprehensively destroyed one of history's most formidable air forces. The Mustang's success came at a terrible cost. In the European theater, 2,520 P-51s were lost in combat. Behind each loss was a young man who would never return home. The 357th Fighter Group alone lost over 100 pilots killed in action, college students, athletes, young professionals who had volunteered to fly and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, when his P-51B was hit by flak near Brunswick. He was 28, married with 2 children he would never see grow up. His loss was repeated thousands of times. Captain Don Gentile, one of America's top Mustang aces with 21.83 aerial victories, survived combat only to die in 1951 testing a T-33 jet trainer. Many Mustang pilots carried psychological wounds that never fully healed, yet their sacrifice achieved something extraordinary. They took the war to the enemy's homeland, forced the Germans to fight over their own territory, and won decisively. From the first appearance of Mustangs over Berlin to VE Day, the Luftwaffe never recovered. From that day forward, it was a broken force, capable only of sporadic, ineffective resistance. The P-51 Mustang had proven that air power, coupled with training, production, tactical innovation, could not just dominate the battlefield, but reshape the course of history itself. They had done it not through individual heroics, though. There was plenty of that, but through superior technology, training, tactics, and industrial support. Colonel Hubert Hub Zonka, one of the war's most successful fighter commanders, provided perhaps the best epitaph for the Luftwaffe. They were magnificent opponents who were simply overwhelmed. The Allies had more of everything: more planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training, more range. The Mustang gave them the ability to apply that advantage anywhere they chose. Once they could escort bombers to Berlin, the mathematics of victory became inevitable. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he witnessed more than enemy fighters, he witnessed the future of air warfare. The P-51 Mustang proved that technology could overcome distance, that industrial capacity could triumph over individual skill, and that a methodical approach could defeat improvised brilliance. The shocked German pilots who encountered Mustangs over Berlin were not just facing a superior aircraft. They were confronting the combined industrial, technological, and organizational power of the United States, projected across an ocean and deep into the heart of their homeland. In that moment, the war in the Iran, ultimately. The war itself had been decisively decided. It was a demonstration of force that shattered every assumption about what was possible in aerial warfare. Hermann Göring's admission that he knew the war was lost the moment American fighters appeared over Berlin has become one of history's most telling acknowledgments of defeat. But the full significance of that moment extends far beyond one man's realization, or even one nation's collapse. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself, the moment when air power became truly strategic, when industrial capacity outweighed warrior tradition, and when organized efficiency triumphed over individual heroism. The German pilots who were shocked by the Mustangs had witnessed something that would echo through the decades: the projection of American power across vast distances, delivered with precision and overwhelming force. Every modern military intervention, from Korea to Kosovo, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, has built upon the foundation laid when those first Mustangs appeared in the skies over Brandenburg. In the final analysis, the P-51 Mustang did more than escort bombers or shoot down German fighters. It transformed the calculus of war, proving that industrialized, technologically integrated, and strategically applied air power could decisively shape the course of a conflict. The lessons of March 6, 1944 remain timeless. Control the skies. Protect your force, and strike decisively, and victory becomes not just possible, but inevitable. It shattered the last illusions of a regime built on lies about racial superiority and national destiny. It proved that free societies, despite their apparent chaos and inefficiency, could organize, innovate, and project power more effectively than totalitarian states. It demonstrated that technology and industry, properly applied, could overcome any defensive advantage of geography or position. The Luftwaffe pilots who looked up in shock at those silver Mustangs on March 6, 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence. Within 14 months, their entire force would be destroyed, their nation occupied, and their ideology discredited. The shock of seeing impossible American fighters over Berlin was the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would culminate in Germany's complete defeat and transformation today. Preserved P-51 Mustangs still fly at air shows, their distinctive Merlin engines producing a sound that veterans of that era recognize instantly. For American veterans, it is the sound of victory. For German veterans, it is the sound that announced the beginning of the end. For historians, it is the sound that changed warfare. Forever the moment when one nation proved it could project decisive air power anywhere on Earth. The story of Luftwaffe pilots, shocked by P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, is ultimately a story about the collision between assumption and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what was thought impossible and what American industry made routine. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and innovation, a story that echoes through every lesson of modern air warfare. A reminder that strategic power belongs not to the strongest alone, but to the force that combines vision, production, skill, and adaptability into one unstoppable whole. You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. But in doing so, you showed us what true air power could be. And in the end, you gave us a lesson far greater than any dogfight, that even the fiercest enemies can become allies in the service of freedom. The Mustangs that had once loomed as instruments of annihilation became, decades later, symbols of liberation, of the enduring power of democracy and industry, and of the strange alchemy by which enemies forged common purpose from the ashes of war. Those young German pilots who had watched silver fighters circle their capital in 1944 had survived to teach new generations, to serve alongside former foes, and to help defend the ideals their own nation had once betrayed. From the roar of Merlin engines over Berlin to the reunions of veterans in the Texas sun, the story of the P-51 Mustang remains as a testament not only to technological brilliance and strategic genius, but to the human capacity for transformation. The shock, fear, and despair it brought in 1944 ultimately became the foundation for cooperation, remembrance, and reconciliation. The Mustang did not merely win a war, it changed the course of history, reshaped the air, and left a legacy that continues to inspire. You shocked us with your industry, your technology, your determination. But the greatest shock came after the war. When you helped us rebuild, when you protected us from Soviet aggression, when you became our friends. The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just end a war. They began a peace. For that, we who survived are forever grateful. The circle was complete. The shock that had begun with Hans Kogler's horrified recognition of American fighters over Brandenburg had transformed through defeat and reconstruction into partnership and friendship. The Mustangs had indeed changed the sky forever, just the sky over Berlin on March 6, 1944. But the strategic sky under which all nations have operated ever since. In that transformation lies the true legacy of the P-51 Mustang, not just as an instrument of victory, but as a catalyst for the post-war world order that followed, the shocked Luftwaffe. Pilots of March 1944 could never have imagined that the American fighters destroying their force would ultimately lead to their nation's redemption and integration into a community of democratic nations. Yet that is exactly what happened. The Mustangs that shocked the Luftwaffe over Berlin didn't just win a war, they helped win a peace that has endured for 8 decades. In the end, that may be their greatest victory of all.